Hey, and welcome to Sociology, Social Problems. Today we're going to continue our conversation about race, right? So we've talked about the basic sociological understandings of the categories of race, but here we are going to talk about how to talk about race, right? Um, and some of the social constructions that have led to the historical lineage of the construction of race. So really, we want to again talk about and go back to the idea that Johnson posed that we need to be able to utilize the language when we talk about race, and we also need to be able to talk about race, right? Even though it makes us uncomfortable. The reason why it makes us uncomfortable is because we have been taught not to talk about race, right? Oftentimes within the white community, we are concerned with talking about race because then we might be considered racist ourselves, right? But to not talk about race really is to bypass a teachable moment and really to take accountability. When we discuss race, we also legitimate and witness people of color's experience, right? So if we utilize this idea of we are a colorblind nation and I'm a colorblind body, we really also, when ignoring the construction of race and ethnicity, we also ignore and we erase that person's experience and whole community's experience. So within the PowerPoint, you can click on these two hyperlinks and watch these videos. If you are in my face-to-face class or hybrid class, we're going to talk about this. So first, let's talk about human zoos. Yay, right? So often what is said is that racism and slavery were a long time ago and we can't dwell on the past. Well, what we need to do is explore our history and the legacy of domination that we all live with. Many people living today have grandparents or great-grandparents that were exposed to or experienced slavery or segregation. So if we think about the timeline of how long ago our country was created, we go back to this idea of colonization and creating the native or the other, right? And so when we do that, we see that when they have the conversations about it, they are constructed within this idea of savagery, of less than, of animalistic, and that continues to be constructed as well as our country's roughly 12 generations, right? And so within 12 generations, think about when colonization happened, and then think about when slavery happened, and think about when segregation happened. Really, that's not that long ago. So we want to think about, so how many of us know our grandparents or great-grandparents' stories, and then does that affect the way we live today? How is that cultural knowledge passed on? So this creates a legacy that Dr. Cornel West talks about later in this PowerPoint, or if you're in a hybrid or face-to-face that we're going to watch. But refers to a legacy that we inherit, right? Legacies of privilege and legacies of trauma, hurt, and domination. So although we didn't create the system, right, we are still recipients or receivers of this system, and we need to take accountability in how we have inherited this and what we're going to do from this point on. So Maya Angelou beautifully sums this concept up. History, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again. And so really what we're saying is that if we continue to not discuss this topic, if we continue to erase or ignore the experiences of people who have been exposed or racism has been enacted upon, we're going to relive this cycle, right? If we even think about the Black Lives Matter movement today, it is the exact same argument that was in the 60s, right? So we have a cyclical relationship that we see the reoccurrence of this pattern because we have yet to reckon with it and we have yet to move forward from it. We have yet to even acknowledge this has happened. So let's think about our past, right? So we're going to watch a video on human zoos, but I want you to get the contextual understanding of it. So human zoos are all part of everyone's past. Human zoos were created much like animal zoos to expose other cultures to major cities and other parts of the world. Human zoos were also created to support the dominant ideologies of value and racial inequality by having black and brown bodies caged with animals much like monkeys. We also see within the academic and medical field, scholars and professionals were paid to do presentations to the white bodies that came to these human zoos about how these black and brown bodies were less valuable, were inferior, were more animalistic. So when they were caged with monkeys, we saw that we would do presentations on how their facial features matched more like an animal or the monkey, and we do presentations about their body size or their head length, or all of this was incredibly inaccurate, but we want to understand that this sets up how we come to know race and ethnicity and racism today. So the initial zoos were created to support the value hierarchy of white bodies, and they were later used in a less formalized fashion to educate communities and towns about the dangers of people with mental illness, intellectual abilities, physical differences, and other non-dominant characteristics by having people come to asylums to watch the ill, right? So if we look in the lower left-hand corner, we see basically a petting zoo where white bodies could come and feed and pet and touch Black and brown children that have been stolen and caged in these human zoos. The lower two right-hand pictures are depictions of mental health facilities, and much like the deplorable treatment of Black and brown bodies, we see how this framework has been applied to the domination of other bodies. So human zoos, science is dirty little secret. Again, you can either Google this or YouTube this, or you can click on this hyperlink. So we're going to play the Guess Who game in class. If you are in an online class, I want you to click on this hyperlink and play this game with a partner. And then I want you to think of how this connects to the readings that I have assigned. Okay, so I want you to, in class, break up into these groups. If you are online, I want you to define and write about how these groups are constructed within the micro and macro levels and the historical context, right? So defining racism, discrimination, and prejudice. We're going to think about the difference between all of these and how they're connected. So there's 4 patterns, right? So there's unprejudiced, non-discriminatory integration, unprejudiced and discriminatory institutional discrimination, prejudice and non-discriminatory, latent bigotry, and then prejudice and discriminatory, which is outright bigotry. So the origin of prejudice and discrimination. So prejudice and bigotry in the individual, we see that manifests as frustration and aggression or projection, right? So we see that when the prejudice and bigotry manifest in the individual, when we try to have these conversations about race and ethnicity, oftentimes the person is projecting their own issues. They get very defensive and they spend so much time defending their prejudice and bigotry that they are unable to take a second and witness, right? If you go back to the mindfulness video, take accountability and witness how their impact of their ideas might affect others, as well as where these ideas came from. So we're going to look at prejudice and bigotry in social structures. Again, social institutions like school or education, religion, government, things of that nature. And then we're going to look at some cultural norms, right? So norms and stereotypes. We're going to see social norms, stereotyping. We're going to see hegemonic domination or homogeny. So institutional discrimination. We see racial profiling. We're going to look at how within education there are things called tracking. We have racial profiling within the police force and within the justice system. We have unequal access to high quality schooling. We have discrimination within the housing sector and employment and income, right? So race and wealth and intergenerational poverty. We're going to look at either online. If you're in an online class, you're going to want to go to your course content and click on the videos that go into detail about each of these systems of discrimination within social institutions. Within the justice system, we see imprisonment and employment discrimination. We see racial inequalities and capital punishment. And then political discrimination, we see how felonies are applied to people of color and how that leads to their disenfranchisement. So institutional discrimination stems from ongoing routines of societies. Social institutions like work or education is different It is different from other types of discrimination because it's not always conscious intent to discriminate. But when we look at the historical legacy or the historical timeline that has built this institutional discrimination, we are going to look at how that has been really bred in, and these social institutions have been built upon discriminatory practices. We are going to watch a video by Tim Weiss and how he talks about the historical legacy of wealth in this country and how that wealth has been and continues to be based around racial discrimination. So there's a Harvard project on school desegregation, and it found a pattern of schools resegregating. So when we look at contemporary times, we see that schools are highly segregated, communities are very segregated geographically, economically, and within the education system, and how that has led to the unequal access and unequitable access to quality schooling and education. This one is incredibly pertinent to our current political milieu or environment. We see anti-voter fraud campaigns are really based in institutional discrimination. We see the civil rights groups note that recent state and federal efforts to investigate voter fraud and institute new systems of voter identification can be seen as attempts to block higher minority voter turnouts. We see this within transportation, within having documentation, within being able to access polling during working hours, all of that kind of stuff. So average years of school completed by persons aged 25 to 29, we see that Black men tend to have the lowest. We see that Black women are just really right along the same timeline. But we want to see how this really influences the legacy or inherited wealth and the legacy and inherited education. So we see that a lot of students within the minority communities are first generation students, much like myself. And then we also want to see how educational funding has provided the foundations for discrimination within these institutional systems. Around 2000, we see that it started to level off. Again, this is 16 years ago, so these analyses are quite different. I want you to look at, utilizing your scholarly article this week, how education has been segregated and within the different ethnic racial categories. Median net worth in families, the effect of the criminal record. We see that white families have a much higher income and median net worth, and we see that within the Black community, and then the number of applicants called back. So if they have a no record, they are still only 14% are called back. If the Black community has a criminal record, they only have a 5% chance of getting called back. While in the white community, there's a 34% chance of being called back for an interview if you have a no record, and a 17% chance of getting called back with a criminal record. So we see that sociological studies have been done on this phenomenon. And really, we have a very disheartening evidence that even if a Black body does not have a criminal record, like a felony, they are still less likely to be called back comparative to a white body who does have a felony or criminal record. So some consequences of prejudice and discrimination: job training, affirmative action. So we see that with job training that people of color often have a less opportunity to access job training. Within affirmative action, we see that there's been a racialization of Mexican Americans in the Southwest especially, and this idea of illegal immigration, which categorizing a body as illegal is very detrimental and continues to reconstruct negative, discriminatory cultural scripts. We have education for equality. Again, we've talked about how education is definitely not equitable or equal, and future prospects. So fighting for a piece of the pie. When we see a student breakdown in 2001 to 2002, we see that the majority of students are white. So if you try to access higher education, you're going to see that still the majority of students are white. And how does that get constructed within the linguistic landscape of higher education institutions, even K through 12 education institutions and systems? Although there has been a rise in minorities going to college, there still is a disproportionate rate of white bodies going to college and having higher ed degrees, which will lead to their future income and inherited wealth that they will pass down through generations. So these are resegregation districts from 1986 to 2000. Again, this is 16 years old. So we can see that with this trend, it is much more bleak today than it was in 2000, and it was pretty bleak in 2000. What we can see here is that there is a significant change. So in the resegregation, so moving students of color into schools that are less equipped, less funded, have higher levels of new teachers, so teachers who don't have the ability or training to be teachers. We also see this within public charter schools like KIPP and Strive. Okay, so we're wrapping up this video. So if you are in my face-to-face class, you will watch these videos in class. If you are not in my face-to-face class, I want you to click on these videos and I want you to write a paragraph response to each video, connecting to sociological language, key terms, and class content thus far. All right, I hope you have a great day. Be kind to yourself and others, and I look forward to chatting with you soon.